Stephen has really covered the ground there. There's nowhere to go, but I have to, so I will. It's very Beckettian. The great secret of dying is, see what happened? I died on stage. Dying and drying are very close together. And I want to start by thinking of a film by Ingmar Bergman called Persona, which is about this moment on stage where a woman, played by Leif Ullmann, is acting a Greek tragedy and falls silent against the horror of the world. It's a kind of a recognition of her mortality in terms of general mortality. And her methodology is to be silent. And the nurse that accompanies her, like us tonight, thrown onto the stage, has to talk, and keeps talking, until these two merge, until they actually, physically, the faces become the same. And you realize that the one who's talking is essentially the one who's powerless, and the one who's silent, the one who's dying on the stage is the one with the power, because they've understood in the way that Stephen has done so beautifully, theatrically, about this process that we're all born into. The only difference is that from the moment we've dropped out of the womb, we're in the process of dying, but it takes a long time to realize that. When you get to a very advanced stage in the game, it's very interesting that the borders between you and the process of dying has not been an event in life as Wittgenstein says, and the world at large, which is also dying at a different time, begins to erode. And you flow out. There's a tremendous sense of release, and in a way that I've no longer feel obliged to wrestle with the process of London, identifying so much with one city, and the city itself in permanent collision, bits of it dying, bits of it being reborn. Don't have to do that anymore. You begin to flow, you begin to let the molecules go. There's a state called Bardo, and the novel that won the Booker Prize by George Sanders is called Lincoln in the Bardo. This is the state between life and death. And in that state, dying is not the end of this event. The dying process goes on, and there's a kind of articulation between the need of the living and the ones who are dead, and the communication between them. But Abraham Lincoln in the book feels obliged to visit his young son, who has died horribly and young, too young, and his grief makes him continue to communicate with his child, who is somewhere in the way that we are all an aspect of those who came before us. W.B. Yeats said in his book, A Vision, which has been my credo all the time, writing about London, the living can assist the imagination of the dead. That the dead are, especially in a city like London, you're aware. You can't walk here without noticing the statues, the memorials, the presence of the writers, the presence of ordinary humans who were around here before us and who are still not completing what they want to do. One of the most remarkable people thinking about what death and dying is was a writer of noir fiction who became quite popular towards the end of his life as Derek Raymond, writing so-called factory novels. And he began as a dubious old Etonian called Robin Cook, and then he had to get out of England for various reasons of dodgy things he'd been up to. And he ended up working in a vineyard in France. And after a certain amount of time, the dream of England came to him so strongly that he wanted to start writing about London again. But at that point, there was now a very successful, schlocky airport novelist called Robin Cook, to say nothing of a Labour politician. So he couldn't be Robin Cook anymore, couldn't be who he was. So he invented and took the name of two dead friends, Derek Raymond, and made himself a new person, and started to write a series of novels in which began often with horrendous murders, but then the detective is much more interesting in meditating in a kind of metaphysical sense about what dying meant than he is in solving these questions. In 1992, I made a film with Derek Raymond called The Cardinal and the Corpse. And in it, I interviewed him in the city airport, in Silvertown. And he gave this interview in the persona of one of the characters in his books. And I'll read it to you. So it is kind of him. He had this idea of what he called the general contract. This is what we're all in. We've all signed up to it, whether we like it or not. We're mortal, and we have to live with that. And dying is something that is there for a very long time. It's a very slow motion process. This is him talking about the general contract in 1992, but somewhat in the persona of his novel, Dora Suarez, The Dead. Their faces remain in my mind much longer than the faces of living people. And that's because, by definition, a dead face never changes. You see it for the last time, and the last time never leaves you, never leaves you. They say the dead don't come back, and sometimes I'm glad when they do, and sometimes I wish they didn't. But they come back anyway. It's not like in real time, going down to the pub, where you might get on with a geezer or you might get on badly. The dead just come back loving you or hating you. It's a terrible thing when they hate you. You can't keep the dead out. You can't keep them out of a room, never mind your head. They come anyway. They rest on your shoulder. Whatever you're doing, they weigh nothing. Not a feather of weight. But they have no new word to say. It's always the same thing. Join us. The river is open. All you have to do is cross it. Be with us. You never were with them. Death lasts much longer than life. And life is really an illusion. I don't cry for the dead. I speak to them, and they speak to me. And that's the end of it. Amen. Mark it with a cross. They're cardboard. They're two-dimensional. They're flat. If you knew them living, you would realize how quickly solid people can become nothing. And yet, be as solid as they ever were. As solid as the future is black for all of us. Or they might turn and say to you, we are all part of the general contract. Join us, join us. Nothing can touch you anymore. Not a bullet, not a fist, not a prayer. And I say to them, is it true you can pass through walls? And they say, of course, if we need to. Like angels, really, we can go anywhere. We can go all over town. People say to me, why do you spend so much time alone? And I say, I'm never alone. I keep my own company. I'm a close man, but I'm open to the dark in a way that most living people are too busy to see. You have to find it to know it. But to know it, you have to want to find it. Or if not, they'll come to you because they want to find you. And the living say, it's bad news to be wanted by the dead. But I don't think so. No, I don't think so at all. Well, he was Robin Cook was an amazing, kind of life-enhancing character who had this extraordinary ability. If he was in this room now and he heard us all talking, and it would probably be a bar if he was in it, so he'd be at the bar. And at the end of the evening, he would be telling you back the stories you told him. And they were now his stories. And the way that Stephen made up one story, he made up all the stories. And his method was to clock into particular pubs in Soho around about lunchtime, stay there sort of right through till throwing out time, back to the suburbs, and then right at night, and absorb and process all this material so that he became part of the city. I was doing an event to celebrate London in the Bridewell Theatre, and I wanted to bring my favourite London writers down to do something there, as well as interview some of them, and some of them would perform. People like Alan Moore gave one of his first public performances, Cathy Acker, and Robin Cook was going to be one of these. Well, I'd heard he was ill. Because he drank so much, he was very energetic, very fit, but suddenly his liver gave out, and I rang him up and said, look, Robin, forget, don't struggle to come. He said, no, oh, yeah, old boy, now I'll be there, I wouldn't miss it for worlds, love it, wonderful stuff. So I'm waiting, and the taxi opens, and like, nobody got out. I looked inside, he was like a ghost. He was like an X-ray. He was sort of literally dying. He passed through dying into something else. But what he did was to perform and talk. He came and he kind of went up to the bar and he had his usual pint of Guinness, but he couldn't drink it, you know, he drank about an inch. And then he got up on the stage and he gave this mesmerizing reading. He picked exactly the part in one of his books where there's a scene in a church and a beam of light comes down, and it was completely haunting to see this ghost reading it as if he'd already gone, and he wanted to do this. And within, I think, 7 or 10 days of this event, he actually was dead. But you can see that somehow the will in your writing, the will in your performance will carry you through to do that. I'll finish with a bit. It's about dying as well, really. It's the book called The Last London, which I've just done, which is about a sense of writing about London that's no longer possible anymore, that the city has become so electronic and digitized, and we're now in a city where systems of surveillance through your phones want to read all your particulars so that you become nothing more than content providers. Essentially, they're going to find your needs before you know you've got them. And a new kind of city is then projected onto you, instead of this thing that I've been describing, these kind of characters. So in the book, I wanted to honour this other sort of older city of people who were dying in different ways and who had memorials. And I'm very taken with W.G. Sebald's book Austerlitz, in which he visits these Jewish cemeteries. But it's a fiction. It's a fictional cast of real walks that he did, and he based a lot of what he was doing on the poet Stephen Watts. Stephen Watts lives and has lived in East London for many years, and he led Sebald around these graveyards, these Jewish burial grounds. So in this book of mine, I went with Stephen to kind of summon up the double ghost, one of Sebald, who had died recently, and secondly of Stephen Watts as a character in the book, inspiring what became a fiction. And Stephen couldn't really remember what was real, what he'd actually done, and what he'd read about himself doing. So it becomes a very strange world between the dying in life and the dying in fiction. I'm going to finish just with a little bit of that. And Stephen's poems, there are poems in it of which he tries to memorialize the dead writer who he liked so much. A few weeks later, courtesy of a radio program on the Sebald's heritage, and after brief visits to Manchester and Norwich, we found ourselves inside the Alderley Road burial ground. Max had reached the point where he confessed that black and white photographs were all that was left of the life of Austerlitz. The fictional character rings the bell beside the locked door in the wall and is admitted to the resting place of the Jewish community, the lime trees and the lilacs. As with so many private London gardens complacent behind a screen of houses, strategic plantings, time slows its momentum. The visitors reach for the right place in which to sit or stand in silence. The young radio producer, with her typed list of questions to feed into cues of the approved script, employed Stephen Watts as the spirit of the place, with the unspoken requirement to channel Austerlitz, who was a predatory ghost who already occupied his studio and had stolen his rucksack. What rough circle in our language has brought us back to here? Those are Stephen's words in his memorial tribute for my friend Max Sebald. The Spitalfields poet paces the cell of his studio, muling the name and summoning another room in Norwich, a room full of photographs in which his friend, the beloved academic, keeps his realm looked after by trees. We were accompanied that afternoon by another London poet and by a young, engaged rabbi. The Talmudic scholar provided a history lesson with all the dates and details. He confirmed the integrity of this hidden garden and the Mile-End community it once served. The spectre of development as ever was hovering, but the rabbi explained that the earth in which a Jew is interred belongs to that man and to his family forever, until the trump of judgment. If any material objects sit comfortably in the old cemetery, it's Stephen Watts's rucksack, Retrieved from Austerlitz, it was returned that afternoon to the road. The poet's trailing lavender scarf is precisely the colour of the flowers dividing the grey slabs of the burial ground at Queen Mary College. A crown of silver hair is wool to his neck, and the vein at his right temple pulses like a worm of the Thames. These last weeks I've been writing you postcards in my head. The canvas womb of the rucksack has weathered into another walk. Its neck is tied with twine, hooped around a padded leather collar like something on a mountain mule. Max, I'm listening, Stephen says, letting the ellipses play out, implying continuity and distance still to be travelled. Reading that sentence about the rucksack being like a womb means I'm going to break Stephen's prohibition, because I haven't got all these years left for this effective time, this thing we've written down to play out. So I'm going to tell you what I wrote on my piece of paper, because it flashed straight into my mind, and it's also very Beckettian. And it is quite simple when it says, this is the closest I've come to dying. Out of the womb, refusing breath.